Lena felt the weight of his eyes on her before she even turned around. Tyrone sat in the corner of the high-end restaurant, his dark gaze following her every move. The sharp clink of glasses and the soft hum of conversation faded into a dull throb in her ears. It was as if the world had narrowed to just him and her, locked in some cruel game only he knew how to play. She adjusted her apron, wiping sweat from the back of her neck, but she couldn't shake the tension crawling up her spine. She'd seen this look before, the one that said, "You can't hide from me forever." She'd tried to keep her distance, to go about her job like any other night. But Tyrone, with his slick words and cold stare, had other plans. He was sitting there on purpose, making it clear he wouldn't let her go that easily. Lena's hands trembled as she poured wine into a glass at the bar, trying to ignore him. But every time she moved, she felt his eyes on her. The slow, deliberate way he leaned back in his chair made the air around him thick, like he was savoring her discomfort. "Bitch thinks she's too good for me now, huh?" Tyrone's voice was low but cutting, loud enough for her to hear from across the room. A few people glanced around uncomfortably, but no one intervened. That was how it always was with him, quietly toxic, like an infection spreading unnoticed. Lena clenched her jaw, her eyes flickering toward the back door. There was no way out. She could leave the restaurant, walk out into the cold night air, but Tyrone would follow. He always did. He knew how to find her. He always had. Then she saw him, Miles Holden, the billionaire CEO, sitting alone at the bar. His sharp suit was perfectly pressed, his posture straight, as if the weight of the world had never touched him. His expression was unreadable, his eyes locked onto the drink in front of him, far away from the chaos around him. Lena hesitated. She knew she shouldn't. It was crazy, it was reckless, but it was the only option left. Her heart pounded as she made her way toward him, her legs heavy with a mixture of fear and something else. Something she couldn't name, she didn't even ask. She just did it. Lena reached him, her body closing the gap between them in a blur of instinct. Without a word, without explanation, she sat on his lap. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. There was a moment of complete stillness, a pause in time. Tyrone's eyes went wide, his mouth falling open in shock. He couldn't process what was happening. He stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor as he took a step forward. But Lena didn't look at him. She didn't care. Miles Holden's body was stiff beneath her, but he didn't push her away. He didn't speak either. He simply remained still, like a stone caught in a river. The silence was deafening. Lena could feel the cold air from the kitchen pressing in on her, mingling with the heat from his body. The restaurant had gone quiet. No one moved. No one breathed. Her heart was pounding in her chest, a quick rhythm that echoed in her ears, louder than the hum of the overhead lights. Her skin burned where her body met his, but she couldn't move. Not yet. Not until she was sure she was safe. Tyrone's confused gaze was locked on her, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes, something almost like fear. She was no longer his to control. In that instant, Lena realized she had done it. She had broken free. The moment was too much, too raw, too exposed. Her breath caught in her throat. The world was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Miles Holden didn't flinch. He sat in the low-lit corner of the restaurant, his back straight, eyes fixed on the rim of his glass. The noise of the room seemed distant to him, a muffled buzz he had long since learned to ignore. Around him, the clink of silverware and quiet laughter mixed with the hiss of the kitchen doors opening and closing, but none of it reached him. In his world, silence was a language more eloquent than words. He had spent years building this empire, this fortress of wealth and influence, by mastering the art of detachment. Nothing, and no one, had ever managed to break through the walls he'd carefully constructed. Not his ruthless business decisions, not his strained family ties, not even the echo of his own broken childhood, the child who had watched his parents fall apart, who had learned early that love came with a price. A price paid in isolation, in endless ambition, in quiet nights spent staring at ceilings, wondering if anyone had ever truly seen him. And now, in this upscale restaurant, he watched the scene unfold before him with a level of detachment only someone like him could manage. The girl, the waitress, was standing in the middle of the floor, her back stiff, her face flushed as Tyrone, the shadow of her past, loomed over her. His words were low, but Miles could hear the venom in them. He could sense the weight of the history between them, the power Tyrone wielded without lifting a finger. But Miles wasn't interested in that history. He was only interested in the moment, the decision, the recklessness. And when Lena, her name was Lena, he had overheard, took the unexpected step of sitting on his lap, Miles didn't blink, didn't move, didn't say a word. He could have reacted, could have pushed her off, demanded to know what she was doing, why she was so desperate. But he didn't. He simply stayed still, the tension of the moment settling around them like a heavy fog. He was both a part of the scene and apart from it, watching it from a place beyond emotion, beyond fear. He was used to control. But in that moment, Lena's audacity, her raw vulnerability, intrigued him. She had crossed a line he never would have. In a place like this, no one took such risks. No one exposed themselves in such a blatant, unguarded way. And yet, she did. Miles found himself studying her, the trembling of her hands as she steadied herself on his lap, the deep breath she took as though preparing for an impact. She was a woman whose life had been shaped by forces he couldn't even begin to imagine, forces that had no room for weakness. But she showed it anyway, in front of him, in front of everyone. For a split second, he felt a shift, a tug at something inside him that he hadn't acknowledged in years. His eyes met hers for the briefest of moments, and in that glance there was a question. Was she looking for protection? Or was she just trying to survive? The silence stretched longer than it should have, the weight of their stillness palpable, heavy. It was a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but thick with meaning. Miles could feel it, the moment teetering on the edge of something dangerous, something fragile, and then, without warning, he whispered. The words were so soft, so quiet, that Lena could hardly catch them. They slipped into the air between them like a secret, something deep, something that unsettled her. The sound was like a thread pulling at the edges of her thoughts. She froze, her body stiffening as she leaned slightly back, unsure of how to process what had just happened. She had expected a push, a question, maybe even an accusation. Instead, she had received a whisper that seemed to bypass her mind and sink straight into her chest. I know you're not like them. The words hung in the air. Lena's heart skipped a beat, the noise of the restaurant now distant in her ears. She looked at him again, trying to read the expression on his face, but his eyes were as unreadable as ever. The briefest flicker of something she couldn't name, passed between them. For the first time, she questioned the choice she had made. Was this man another danger? Another form of control? Or was there something about him that she couldn't see yet? Something beyond the wealth, beyond the cold exterior? Her mind raced, but her body stayed still, the tension now laced with uncertainty. The silence had shifted, and with it something inside her began to unravel. But before she could process any further, Miles stood up slowly, his hand gently guiding her off his lap, his fingers brushing against the fabric of her uniform. There was no rush, no urgency, just a quiet, deliberate movement, as he did. His gaze softened for the briefest of seconds, almost imperceptible, and then he was gone, walking toward the exit with the same quiet confidence he'd walked in with. Lena was left standing there, her heart still pounding, her mind spinning, with only the echo of that whisper in her ears. The echo of Tyrone's voice followed her, even in the silence of her apartment. Lena leaned against the kitchen counter, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. The pale morning light filtered through the blinds, casting thin shadows across the cracked tile floor. She should have been preparing for the day, but instead she was stuck in the memories of a past she couldn't shake. No matter how hard she tried, her childhood had never been easy. She remembered the small, cramped apartment they had lived in, the kind of place where the walls seemed to close in around you, suffocating any hope. She'd learned early that safety didn't come from comfort. It came from fighting for what little you had. Her mother had worked double shifts as a janitor, her father had long since disappeared, and Lena had learned how to fend for herself at a young age. But it hadn't always been like that. There had been dreams once, dreams of escaping, of making something of herself. She used to imagine a life filled with light, a life where she could stand tall and never have to fear anyone. But those dreams always seemed out of reach, like smoke curling up into the sky, too fragile to hold on to. Then Tyrone had come into her life. He was different at first, charming, funny, and full of promises. He promised love. He promised security. He promised that things would be better. In the beginning, he had made her feel seen. For the first time, someone had looked at her and made her believe she was worth something. But it didn't take long for the mask to fall. It started small, comments here and there. Like, "You sure you want to wear that?" Or, "If you were really trying, you'd be something better." At first, she thought it was just him being protective or maybe teasing her. But over time, those words started to sink in, carving away at her self-esteem piece by piece. Soon, it wasn't just the words. It was the way he'd look at her, like she was something to control, something to bend to his will. And when it turned physical, Lena didn't know what to do. The first slap had left her stunned, paralyzed by disbelief. This isn't love, she had thought. This isn't what love is supposed to feel like. But Tyrone had apologized, pulling her close with promises of change. "It was a mistake," he'd said. "You know I love you." Lena had believed him, like she had believed every other promise he made. But the cycle kept repeating. The insults, the silent treatments, the broken glass, the bruises hidden beneath long sleeves. With every cycle, it became harder to tell where love ended and control began. Her world had shrunk. Everything she did was measured against his approval, every movement a potential source of his anger. Slowly, Tyrone had become the storm she lived inside, the very thing that threatened to tear her apart. It was in that storm that she had lost herself. When she sat on Miles's lap the night before, it wasn't just to escape Tyrone. It was a desperate attempt to find something, anything that wasn't dominated by him. In that one reckless act, she had wanted to feel control again, to claim some piece of herself that hadn't been stripped away. But the truth was, she didn't know if it had been for protection or for something deeper. A part of her had known that sitting on a stranger's lap in a public place was a choice made out of desperation. Yet another part of her had wondered if, somehow, it was the only way to prove to herself that she wasn't just Tyrone's anymore, that she still had some say in her own story. Her hand tightened around the coffee cup as the shame washed over her. She had hoped for something more when she'd made that move. But now, sitting alone in her apartment, Lena couldn't tell if she had been looking for a way out of Tyrone's grip, or if she had been seeking something else entirely, someone to tell her she wasn't as broken as Tyrone had made her believe. Her stomach twisted as the weight of it all settled in. She had never been good at defining herself. People like Tyrone, people who controlled her, had always been the ones to define her. In that brief moment of vulnerability with Miles, had she been trying to reclaim her power? Or was it something deeper, something she wasn't ready to face? Lena stared at her reflection in the window, watching the world move on outside. It all felt so far away. The life she wanted, the life she'd dreamed of as a child, now seemed like a distant memory. But there was one thing she was certain of. She couldn't go back. The question was, where could she go now? The answer wasn't clear yet, but for the first time in a long time, Lena didn't feel entirely lost. The question lingered, heavy but necessary. Was she just looking for a way to escape, or was she trying to find something worth fighting for? And as the soft hum of the city outside filled the room, the weight of the question hung in the air, unanswered. The silence in Miles Holden's office was thick. Lena sat across from him, the polished surface of his desk between them like a chasm neither was willing to cross. The room was cold, too cold for comfort, the sharp angles of the modern furniture casting long, sharp shadows. It was a room designed for control, but today it felt like something else, like a space waiting for a storm. Miles hadn't said anything when she entered. He simply gestured for her to sit, his gaze briefly flicking over her as if calculating something. She sat stiffly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her mind was still spinning from the incident in the restaurant, the weight of her own rash decision pressing down on her chest. She hadn't expected him to call her in. He could have ignored the whole situation, dismissed it like any other fleeting moment. But instead, here they were, alone. "I've been thinking," Miles began, his voice quiet, measured, yet there was an edge to it, a cool curiosity. He leaned back in his chair, watching her closely. About what happened last night, Lena didn't respond. She wasn't sure she could. The memory of sitting on his lap, the heat of the moment still clung to her like a second skin. She had acted out of desperation, not thinking about the consequences. Now, facing him across this sterile, clinical space, she felt the sharp sting of her own choices. "I'm curious," Miles continued, his tone even. "Why did you do it?" Lena's gaze shifted to the window, watching the faint movement of traffic below. She didn't want to answer, didn't want to reveal the raw truth, the vulnerability she'd tried so hard to keep hidden. Her mind screamed at her to stay silent, to maintain control, to hide the part of herself that was still tangled up in the past. But Miles was relentless, his silence pressing in on her like a weight. "I had to do something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tyrone." She trailed off, unsure of how to explain the suffocating presence of him that had haunted her life for so long. How do you explain fear when it's lived inside you for years? Miles didn't say anything, just waited. His eyes were steady, like an ocean without waves, calm but deep and full of something unspoken. Lena shifted in her seat, her fingers trembling slightly. The confession hung in the air between them, but it wasn't the whole truth. She knew that. It wasn't just Tyrone she had been trying to escape. The truth was more complicated than that. She had been trying to escape herself, escape the weakness she felt, the self-doubt, the belief that she wasn't worth saving. "You're not just running from him," Miles finally said, his voice quieter now, almost like he was thinking aloud. "You're running from something else, aren't you?" Lena's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected him to see that, to pierce through the mask she had carefully built around herself. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, she swallowed hard, her heart racing. "I don't need your help," she finally managed to say, deflecting. "I don't need anyone's help." Miles didn't flinch at her words. Instead, he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, his gaze never leaving hers. "Maybe you don't think you need help," he said, his voice low, "but you do. You can't outrun everything forever, Lena." Her pulse quickened, and she felt a heat rise in her chest. She had built her life on the idea of doing it alone, surviving alone. She didn't know how to answer him, how to explain that the idea of leaning on someone, even for a moment, felt like surrender. But before she could speak, Miles shifted the conversation. "You know," he began, "I used to think control was everything. It was the only thing I could count on. The only thing I could trust." Lena looked up at him, surprised by the sudden change. She hadn't expected him to open up about anything, much less something personal. "I built this company from the ground up," he continued, his tone a little darker now. "Every decision, every move calculated to keep me on top. I built a world where nothing could touch me, nothing could threaten me." He paused, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the desk. "But it was all a lie, Lena, the whole thing. A lie I've been telling myself for years." Lena's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "The company, the success, it's all just a facade. A way to keep the world at arm's length," he said, his eyes dropping briefly to his hands. "I've been hiding behind it, thinking that if I built something powerful enough, no one could see the cracks. But I'm starting to realize." He stopped, shaking his head slightly, as if admitting something he'd never said aloud before. "I'm starting to realize that all of it has been built on lies," Miles finished, his voice barely above a whisper. "And now I'm not sure it's even worth it anymore." Lena sat in stunned silence, her own struggles suddenly seeming smaller in the face of his admission. She had come here expecting to defend herself, to maintain her distance. But now she couldn't ignore the weight of his words. Miles wasn't untouchable. He was as trapped in his own web of lies as she was in hers. And for a moment, Lena saw him as something more than just the cold, distant CEO. He was just another person, searching for something real, something honest. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. And as she sat there, the truth she had been avoiding for so long, both her own and his, began to settle in, reshaping the air between them. Miles Holden had spent his entire life building walls. Every piece of his empire was a stone, every decision a mortar that held them in place. He'd crafted his world so carefully, so deliberately, that no one could see past the polished surface. Not the business partners, not the employees, and certainly not the people who watched him from afar. They saw the suit, the wealth, the confidence, but none of them ever saw the cracks. And yet, when Lena walked into his life, something began to shift. A subtle shift at first, barely noticeable, like a crack in glass that spreads silently until it shatters. He'd watched her since the restaurant, watched how she carried herself with a kind of guarded grace. She was different. She didn't hide behind masks. She didn't pretend to be anything she wasn't. And for reasons he couldn't explain, that raw honesty unsettled him. At night, alone in his penthouse, Miles often found himself replaying their conversations. He'd asked her why she had done what she did, why she'd sat on his lap, exposed herself like that. But he knew it wasn't just about her. It was about him too, about how she had looked at him with eyes that seemed to see through his defenses. She saw him, and he didn't know how to handle that. In the silence of his office the next morning, he let his thoughts drift back to his childhood, back to the days before power, before the suits, before the empire. Back to the boy who had learned early that survival didn't come from kindness. It came from strength. His father's voice echoed in his mind, harsh and cutting, reminding him of his worthlessness. You're nothing unless you're the best. No one will care about you unless you show them why they should. Miles had spent his life trying to prove those words wrong. But no matter how much wealth he accumulated, no matter how many people he impressed, he never felt enough. It was like he was still that boy, looking into the mirror and seeing nothing but failure staring back. And his mother? She had left him when he was still a child, walking out without a single word. He never understood why. She had been everything to him, and yet she'd vanished without a trace. That abandonment had left a scar that never healed. She had been his first teacher in the art of detachment, teaching him that it was safer to shut people out than to let them in. But Lena was different. She was an open book, raw and unashamed of her scars. When they spoke, she didn't hide behind the armor of control the way he did. He could feel the strength beneath her vulnerability, the kind of strength he had learned to suppress long ago. It fascinated him and it terrified him. One afternoon, they sat together in the corner of a quiet cafe. The atmosphere was calm, but Miles felt the tension between them like static in the air. They had been talking for hours, about everything and nothing. The conversation had drifted from business to their personal lives, but every word that passed between them felt charged, as though they were both tiptoeing around something too big to address. Lena took a deep breath, then asked, "What was it like growing up for you?" Miles stiffened, surprised by the question. He had never shared his past with anyone, not like this. But something about Lena's curiosity, her earnestness, made him want to speak. It was as though he couldn't stop himself, as though she was peeling back layers of him he didn't even know existed. He glanced down at his coffee cup, then back at her. "It wasn't easy," he began, his voice low. "My father, he didn't believe in anything but success. There was no room for mistakes, no room for weakness. Every day it was like a race, and if you weren't ahead, you were nothing." He paused, his eyes darkening. "I don't know if he ever loved me. Not really. All he cared about was winning." Lena's expression softened, and she leaned in slightly, her voice gentle. "And your mom?" He swallowed hard, feeling the familiar sting of abandonment. "She left when I was young. No explanation, just gone. It was like she erased herself from my life. I never understood why." Lena nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "That must have been hard." "Yeah," he muttered. "But I learned. I learned to rely on myself, to trust that I was the only one who could get what I wanted. Power was the only thing that mattered." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Miles had never admitted this much to anyone. He hadn't even realized how much of it he still carried with him. Lena shifted in her seat, her voice quieter now. "I can't imagine growing up like that. I never had anyone who pushed me like that. I had to fight for everything on my own." Miles looked at her, surprised by the raw honesty in her voice. She was so different from the women he was used to, so different from the cold, calculated world he had built. She was real. "Lena," he said softly, the words catching in his throat. "I've never met anyone like you." She met his gaze, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something deeper. For the first time, she didn't look away. The silence that followed was different from the one they had shared before. It was heavy with something unspoken. Something neither of them had acknowledged. Lena's heart raced and she could feel her pulse in her fingertips as she realized something she hadn't expected. She was drawn to him, not just to the man he appeared to be, but to the cracks in his armor, the vulnerability he had let slip. She didn't fully understand it, but she knew that whatever it was unlike anything she'd ever felt before. Miles, for the first time, let his guard down just a little, and in that brief, charged moment, he saw her for who she truly was. A woman who wasn't afraid to show the world her broken pieces, to fight for what she believed in no matter the cost. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. But in that silence, something had shifted. And for the first time, neither of them knew where it would lead. Lena knew it was coming before she heard the footsteps. She was restocking the bar when she felt the chill settle into her bones. The hum of the restaurant, the clinking of glasses, and the quiet conversations all seemed to fade into the background as the door swung open. She didn't need to look. She knew he was here. Tyrone. Her heart stuttered, a jolt of panic surging through her chest. She forced herself to stay calm, to keep her hands steady, as she placed the bottles back on the shelf. The sound of his boots on the hardwood floor grew louder, closer, like the slow, deliberate march of a predator circling its prey. Lena. His voice was low, almost too soft, like a snake's hiss. We need to talk. Her body tensed, every muscle in her frame locking in place. She didn't turn to face him. She couldn't, not yet. She had made a promise to herself, never again. But the weight of his presence, the aura of dominance he carried with him, made that promise feel like an illusion. She could hear the smirk in his voice even though she hadn't looked at him. Still playing hard to get? Tyrone's words were coated with mockery. You know, I don't like to be ignored. Lena gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. She had no choice but to face him now. Slowly, she turned around, forcing her eyes to meet his. What she saw wasn't the man she used to love. It was a stranger, someone who wore his anger like armor, who carried resentment in his eyes like a shield. What do you want? She said, trying to sound steady, but her voice wavered despite her best efforts. Tyrone took a step closer, his gaze flicking over her like he was deciding what part of her to break first. I want you back, Lena. I've always wanted you back. You don't just walk out on me and think I'm going to let it slide. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the tension rising between them like a storm. Lena could feel her pulse hammering in her throat, the anxiety crawling up her spine. But she forced herself to stay in the moment. You don't own me, she said. Her voice firmer now, though it still carried an undertone of fear. I'm done with you. I'm not going back to that life. Tyrone's face darkened, the humor in his eyes fading, replaced with something far more dangerous. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them, his breath hot on her face. Not going back? He repeated, his voice dangerously low. You think you can just leave me behind and walk away into some fairy tale with that rich guy, huh? His words cut through her, but she held her ground, refusing to let him see how much they hurt. I'm not the same person I was, she said, her voice shaking now. I've changed, and so have you. This isn't love, Tyrone. It's control. Tyrone's lips curled into a sneer. He reached out suddenly, grabbing her wrist with a grip that burned. You're mine, Lena, and you'll remember that. The world around them seemed to collapse into a single unbearable moment. Lena struggled against him, but his hand tightened, pulling her toward him with force. She could feel the old fear creeping back, the instinct to submit, to stay quiet, to do whatever it took to avoid the storm he had always brought. But this time, she wasn't going to back down. With everything inside her, she wrenched her arm free from his grasp. The sting of his touch lingered, but the rage inside her burned hotter. Let go of me, she said through gritted teeth. Tyrone's smile vanished, and in an instant the room seemed to darken. His hand shot out, slamming her into the counter. The force of the impact made her head spin. She gasped for breath, her chest constricting as the familiar weight of fear settled on her. Don't make me do this. Lena, he hissed, his voice a low growl. Everything in her screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. The walls of the restaurant, once a refuge, now felt like a cage. She felt trapped between the past she couldn't escape and the future she was too afraid to embrace. Then, she thought of Miles, the way he had looked at her with something she'd never seen before. Respect, understanding. He had seen her for what she was, not what Tyrone had tried to mold her into. She thought of the way she had felt in his presence, not as a possession, but as a person with the right to choose. This was it. The breaking point. Lena took a deep breath, her hands trembling but her resolve hardening. She could not let Tyrone pull her back into that life. Not again, not ever. With every ounce of strength she had, she shoved him off, the force of her movement surprising him for just a second. It was enough. He staggered back, his face contorted in rage. "You'll regret this," he spat, his fists clenching at his sides. But Lena didn't wait for his threat to materialize. She turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. As she burst through the back door of the restaurant and into the alleyway, the cold air hit her like a slap. She didn't stop running. She couldn't. She had just made a choice that would change everything. But it wasn't the kind of freedom that came easily. She could already feel the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders. Tyrone wouldn't give up. He would keep coming. But for the first time, Lena didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a survivor, and no matter what happened next, she knew she had crossed a line. There was no going back now. The door to the alley slammed shut behind her, the sound sharp, final. Lena's breath came fast and shallow, her heart still racing from the chaos inside. The familiar weight of Tyrone's anger pressed against her back, but she didn't look back. She couldn't. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back now. The alley was empty, cold, the late afternoon shadows stretching long across the pavement. This was her moment. She had run from Tyrone for years, physically, emotionally, spiritually. But the chase had never been one-sided. He had always been there, always following, always reminding her that he still owned a piece of her, that she could never truly escape, until now. She stood there for a moment, feeling the chill of the air wrap around her like a new coat. It was the kind of cold that cuts through you, sharp and bitter. But it wasn't the same kind of cold that Tyrone had left behind. That was the kind of cold that numbed you from the inside out, until you couldn't remember what warmth felt like. But now, the cold felt like freedom. Lena took a deep breath and wiped her eyes, smearing the streaks of tears she hadn't even realized she'd shed. She wasn't the girl who had walked into that restaurant a few weeks ago, trapped in her past. She wasn't the girl who had been desperate enough to sit on Miles's lap. She was someone different now. Someone stronger. The sound of footsteps behind her broke the silence, but she didn't flinch. She already knew who it was. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't turn. Tyrone's voice rang out like an accusation. "Lena!" His voice had that sharp edge, the one that had always made her feel small, insignificant. But now it felt distant, like an echo from a life she had just left behind. "You think you can just walk away from me?" Tyrone's voice was low, dangerous. He was getting closer, but Lena didn't turn around. "You think you can just throw away everything we had like it meant nothing?" Lena felt the familiar fear stir inside her, but she pushed it down. She wasn't going to run again. She wasn't going to be afraid anymore. She turned to face him. He was standing there, his arms crossed, his face twisted in anger. He hadn't changed. The same anger, the same manipulation. It was all still there, lurking just beneath the surface. But this time, Lena didn't shrink from it. She stood tall, her chest rising and falling with each breath steady and strong. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not throwing anything away, Tyrone. I'm just taking back what you stole from me." He laughed, a bitter, cruel sound that echoed off the walls. "What, you think you're free? You think you can just walk away from me and have some fairy tale life? You'll always be mine, Lena. You'll never be rid of me." Lena shook her head, the weight of his words sinking in for the first time. It wasn't just his threats that had held her down all these years. It was the belief that she didn't deserve better. The belief that she was broken, that she had no right to choose a different life. She had let him make her feel small for so long, but she couldn't do it anymore. "You don't own me," she said, each word cutting through the air like a knife. "You never did. And I'm done with you." Tyrone's face darkened and his fists clenched. "You think you can just walk away like it's that simple? You can't do this to me, Lena. You owe me. Lena took a step forward, her voice rising now, shaking with emotion. I don't owe you anything. I've paid my dues to you, to this life, and I'm done. I don't need you. I never did. The words felt like fire in her mouth, burning away the last of the fear, the last of the doubt. For the first time in years, she saw herself clearly, no longer through the lens of Tyrone's control, but through her own strength. She wasn't his to break anymore. Tyrone stepped forward, his eyes wild with fury. You think you're better than me? You think that guy, he spat the word out, Miles, is going to save you? He doesn't care about you? He's just like all the others. He'll leave you just like I did. You'll always come crawling back to me. You're nothing without me. Lena's heart hammered in her chest, but she didn't flinch. She felt her hands ball into fists, the anger rising inside her, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was out of defiance. I'm not going back to you, Tyrone, she said, her voice steady now. I'm walking away and I'm not looking back. You can't control me anymore. Tyrone stood there for a moment, his chest heaving, his face twisted with rage. But Lena didn't back down. She didn't flinch when he took another step toward her. She stood her ground, and then, for the first time, he stopped. The air between them grew heavy, and Tyrone, for all his anger, didn't move. His face softened, just for a second, and in that brief moment Lena saw something in his eyes that she hadn't seen in years. A crack in his power, but it didn't matter anymore. She was done with the lies, done with the manipulation, done with the past. Lena turned and walked away, the sound of her boots on the pavement steady and strong. As she walked, the weight of Tyrone's presence lifted from her shoulders. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if she was ready for it, but for the first time she felt free. Free from him, free from everything he had made her believe, and that for now was enough. The world outside was still. Lena sat on the edge of her bed, her hands folded in her lap, looking out the window at the city below. The streetlights flickered faintly in the distance, casting long shadows that stretched like old memories. The quiet was thick, almost suffocating, but it was different now. There was no fear in the stillness anymore, no weight pressing down on her chest, no chains keeping her from breathing. She had come a long way from the woman who had walked into the restaurant that night, trapped in the endless cycle of Tyrone's control. The woman who had thought she had no way out. She was no longer bound by the past, no longer defined by the pain that had once ruled her every decision. The scars were still there, but they didn't hurt anymore. Lena had taken her life back. She had stopped running, stopped hiding, and for the first time, she felt the power of her own strength. The strength that had always been inside her, but had been buried beneath years of fear and self-doubt. She had fought for this, fought to be seen, fought to be heard. And now, standing on the other side of it, she could finally exhale. Her relationship with Miles had shifted too. What had begun with a moment of desperate escape had transformed into something deeper, something that neither of them had expected. In the weeks since that night, they had spent more time together, talking, understanding each other in ways neither had anticipated. They had shared pieces of their pasts, their fears, their hopes. And in that exchange, they had both found something that had been missing in their lives. Someone who truly saw them, who understood the weight of their struggles. Miles had been through his own transformation. In the quiet moments they spent together, he had shown her sides of himself that no one had ever seen. The cold exterior he had spent years perfecting had cracked, and beneath it was a man who wasn't so different from her. He too had been shaped by the darkness of his past, by a childhood of emotional abandonment, by a relentless pursuit of success that had left him empty. But Lena had opened his eyes to something else. She had reminded him that success was not just about building an empire, but about building connections, about being vulnerable and honest. She had shown him that there was more to life than just power. The quiet mornings they spent together had become a small sanctuary. They would meet for coffee, their conversations easy, unforced, each moment building something more than either of them had ever thought possible. There was no pressure, no expectations, just the simple act of being there for each other. One afternoon, they sat on the couch in his apartment, the city skyline stretching behind them. Miles was flipping through a book, but his gaze kept drifting to her. He didn't say anything at first, just watched her with a quiet intensity that made her heart flutter. "You've changed," he finally said, his voice soft. Lena looked up from the book she had been reading, meeting his eyes. "I don't know if it's change exactly," she said. "More like reclaiming what was always mine." Miles set the book down and turned his body toward her. "It's not just that," he said, his voice low. "It's the way you've learned to live with your past without letting it control you." "It's powerful." Lena smiled, though the weight of his words lingered in the air. "You've changed too," she said. "I see it in you." He shifted, his gaze turning inward for a moment. "I used to think success was everything, but I see now. It's not just about building something to stand on. It's about what you build with the people around you." He paused, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I think you've helped me see that." Lena felt something stir in her chest, a warmth, a quiet pride that she hadn't known was missing until now. Miles was right. She had helped him see a new way of being, just as he had helped her find a new path forward. There was a softness between them now, an unspoken understanding that neither of them had expected. It wasn't about fixing each other, or filling the emptiness they had both felt for so long. It was about finding something whole, something real in the space between them. For the first time, Lena understood that her journey wasn't just about escaping Tyrone or breaking free from her past. It was about discovering who she was without the weight of those chains. It was about stepping into her own future, with or without anyone's approval. She no longer felt like she had to prove her worth. She knew who she was now, and that was enough. As the day stretched into evening, Miles reached over and took her hand. It wasn't a gesture born out of need or expectation. It was simply a moment of connection, of quiet support. They didn't speak for a while, just sat there, hand in hand, watching the city unfold before them. There was something profoundly peaceful in that moment. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of understanding, full of all the things they didn't need to say. Lena realized she was no longer running from her past. She had faced it, and in doing so had reclaimed the future she had once thought was impossible. There would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time she felt ready to face them. The past no longer defined her. She had found something far stronger, herself, and with Miles by her side, she knew that whatever came next, they could face it together. The sun had just started to dip below the skyline, casting a soft orange glow over the city. For the first time in a long time, Lena didn't feel the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. The streets were busy, filled with the hum of life, but there was a quiet within her, a peace she had never known before. She and Miles stood at the edge of the park, watching the sunset in silence. Neither spoke, but the air between them was filled with something more than words. It was understanding. It was trust. Lena looked at him, her gaze steady. The man who had once seemed so distant, so untouchable, was now someone she knew in a way she hadn't thought possible. Not because of what he had, but because of what he had shown her. The man behind the wealth, the mask of success. The man who had faced his own demons just as she had faced hers. They had both been searching for something beyond the lies of their pasts, something beyond the pain they had endured. And in each other they had found it, though not in the way either of them had expected. For Lena, the journey had been one of breaking free from the chains of Tyrone's control, of discovering her worth outside of the abuse and manipulation. She no longer saw herself as a victim, but as a woman who had taken back what was rightfully hers, her voice, her power, and her future. She had learned to let go of the past, to stop defining herself by the mistakes she had made, by the people who had tried to define her. She was more than that now, stronger, and for the first time she didn't feel like she had to prove anything to anyone. Miles, too, had been changed by this journey. His life, once centered solely around building an empire of success and wealth, had begun to shift. He had realized that no amount of power could fill the void inside him. The constant pursuit of more had only led to emptiness. Now, standing beside Lena, he understood that true fulfillment came not from the accolades or the towering buildings, but from the people you build your life with. From the connections, the honesty, and the respect you give and receive. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was chasing something just to prove he was enough. He knew now that he was enough, simply by being who he was. They were both different now, wounded in ways that would never fully heal, but stronger for it. The scars they carried no longer defined them. They had learned to wear them, to accept them as part of their story, but not as the whole of it. What now? Lena asked quietly, breaking the silence. Miles glanced over at her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He hadn't asked himself that question in a long time. But with her, it didn't feel like an unknown. It felt like a beginning. "I don't know," he said, his voice calm but certain. "But I do know this, we'll figure it out. Together." Lena nodded, the weight of those words sinking in. Together. It was all they needed. They didn't need a clear path ahead. They didn't need to have it all figured out. What they had at that moment was enough. The uncertainty wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. They had both come through the fires of their pasts, each scar a mark of survival, not defeat. Now, with the future ahead of them, they stood side by side, not as two broken people trying to be whole, but as two individuals who had found strength in each other's vulnerability. The future was still uncertain, but it was theirs to build, not on power or fear, but on truth, respect, and healing. As the last of the sunlight faded into dusk, they began walking. Not toward a destination, but simply forward, together. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew they were ready to face it side by side, with the quiet strength they had found in each other. And that for now was enough. The cafe was quiet, the clink of coffee cups and soft murmur of conversation the only sounds that filled the space. Outside, the world moved on, but inside, time felt still, as if the universe had momentarily paused to let them be. Lena sat across from Miles, her fingers wrapped around a warm mug. The steam rose gently from it, curling into the air like the thoughts she still hadn't fully sorted out. It had been months since the night she walked away from Tyrone, months since the moment her life had shifted. She could still feel the weight of those first few steps after she'd left him behind. Each one had been heavy with uncertainty, but now, looking back, she could see that every step had been a release, like peeling away layers of a life she'd outgrown. Miles sat across from her, his eyes steady but softer than they had ever been. The man who had once seemed so untouchable, wrapped up in power and control, was now someone who shared her silences, her vulnerabilities. They had both changed, molded by the struggles they'd faced. And in the quiet between them now, it wasn't a silence of fear or uncertainty. It was a silence of understanding. "I used to think my life was set," Miles said, breaking the silence, "that I had to keep chasing after things to feel fulfilled. But now, I don't know. I think I was running away from something all this time." Lena's gaze met his, and she could see the truth in his words. The chase for success, the hunger for power, it had always been a distraction, a way to avoid facing what really mattered. But now, with the weight of their pasts behind them, they had found something more real, something lasting. "Maybe we all have to run for a while," Lena said softly. "But eventually we realize we're only running from ourselves." Miles nodded, his fingers tracing the edge of his cup. "I think I was running from the fear of being alone, of not being enough. But with you, I don't feel that anymore." Lena smiled, the warmth of his words sinking in. There was a quiet power in what they had built together, something that had nothing to do with expectations or past mistakes. It was just two people, learning to trust again, learning to stand beside each other without the weight of everything that had held them down. They had both been lost, in different ways. But now they had found something new, something not defined by their pasts but by the strength they had discovered in each other. And though neither of them had all the answers, they knew that the journey was far from over. The cafe felt even quieter now, as if the world had faded into the background. It was just the two of them. In this moment and in that silence, Lena realized something. She was no longer defined by what had happened to her. She was defined by what she was willing to become, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly free. Miles leaned back slightly, and his eyes softened even more. He didn't say anything at first, but the silence between them spoke volumes. Then, almost like an afterthought, he leaned forward and whispered, "I'm glad you stayed." Lena's heart skipped a beat. The words weren't loud, but they carried so much weight. And in that simple whisper, she felt the promise of something more. The kind of future that wasn't tied to the past, but to the potential of what they could build together. She didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached out and placed her hand gently over his. No words were necessary. They both understood that this quiet moment was the beginning of something new. As they sat there side by side, the world outside kept moving. But inside, there was peace, hope, a shared understanding that no matter how dark the past, there was always the possibility for a brighter, more fulfilling future. And with that, the story didn't end. It was just beginning.